Hey students, how are you? I'm coming to you live from my writer's retreat. It's really fun to be working at a writer's retreat right now and preparing for this class, getting notes ready. So, what I'm going to do right now, you have seen my PowerPoint. Hopefully, you've already looked at the introduction to poetry. We're about to really get into some modern poetry. I'm going to give you some specific authors to read in a little bit in the next sections coming up. I want you to read those because these are some key authors that speak in very different voices. They're very unique from each other. Uh, they have different styles, different topics, different settings, different histories and backgrounds, different beliefs from each other. But I want to introduce you to some modern voices, many of whom are still alive today. And then I'm going to give you some suggested readings at the very end. I really want you to look at just, it takes 2 or 3 minutes to read a poem. Look at a good diversity of these poems and find your style, find what you like. I even challenge you a little bit to write your own poetry. But poetry touches people differently. And a lot of times people say, oh, I hate poetry. But that's because they've only been exposed to maybe Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson, and that's not your style, or Greek or Roman epic poetry, and that's not your style. There's thousands of poets out there in the world that each have a different voice. Some are aiming at teens, young adults, different nationalities, different experiences that they're sharing with us. So don't just shut down poetry because and say, I don't like poetry. Because I mean, truly poetry is so diverse that I really challenge you to find something that you like. For example, I'm going to talk to you now about a couple of poets that I just want to introduce you to. We're going to look at some of their writings, and I've got to find my notes here on who they are. There we go. This is what I'm talking about, the first one. Okay. A lot of people who say, I don't like poetry, can't relate to any of it. Look at Brian Turner. Brian Turner, currently still alive when I'm filming this, born in 1967, so he's a little bit younger than me. That gives my age away. He's an American poet. He's an essayist. He's also a professor. His debut collection of poetry was actually a national award winner. What makes him unique? He is writing about his experience during the Iraq War. He was a soldier. He is not a poet who went and talked to soldiers and decided to write on war. He is giving us his perspective of what it was like to be on the front lines in Iraq. And that's something that's unique. I have never been in a war. I just never have. And I don't know what it feels like to be in a war, to be on the battlefield, to have people shooting at me, to see death that close. I've seen death. I have been with relatives when they passed away, but I've never been on the battlefield. So he is writing about his experiences. His imagery is war imagery. The scenes that he gives, some of it is peaceful, some of it is a moment break when he was able to take some time outside of the battle. And so it's not like every single poem he writes is a battle poem written on the battlefield, but a lot of it is because a lot of people say, I don't understand. What is PTSD, for example, post traumatic stress syndrome, that a lot of soldiers experience? What is that all about? When you read his poetry, you can understand the depth of why somebody would be traumatized because they were in a war. He's giving us a glimpse of a life, a moment in a life. Of course, he's much more than just a soldier, but he is giving us a glimpse of what life was like on the front lines um, during the Iraq War. So he's also married to a poet. So Their experiences are quite different. You can look up his bio. I'll put some links in his section. You can look up his bio and look up his wife if you want to. I'm just giving you a glimpse of the poets that we're going to talk about. So you understand when I say that people say, I don't like poetry, there's something out there that you like. There is a type of poetry that you can relate to. I imagine that a lot of soldiers, for example, may say, I don't like poetry. What's poetry got to do with me? Here's Brian Turner. He's telling you, hey, I'm writing from your perspective. I am telling the world what it was like to be us on the front lines of the Iraq War. Um, a very different person that we're going to look at, but Nikki Giovanni. She's her front lines were different. Nikki Giovanni is still a professor, still actively teaching, as I understand it, at the time of this recording in 2020. She was born in 1943. So you can imagine that coming up in her time era, one of the things she was from Knoxville, Tennessee. So she has some beautiful poems. I'm from Tennessee, so I love these poems about Tennessee, about her hometown and just what it was like when she was a kid, what she remembers, the images from her perspective. But when I talk about then her front lines were different from Brian Turner's, is that she was also a civil rights activist. She knew what it was like to be part of the movement in the 1960s in the United States, fighting for just basic rights. And so she talks about those front lines at times. She also writes and has a beautiful, beautiful speech about what it was like to be at Virginia Tech um, during the shooting. Virginia Tech had a very tragic shooting. I can't remember the exact number of people who died. Um, I think it's 23, but don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure. But she was there on campus and writes about what it was like to be on the scenes when there was a student shooting and student and professor's death on a campus. So her front lines are very different from Brian Turner's. And just some of her poems, again, about Knoxville, Tennessee, are just about life in a rural area. She was out, she talks about the house and the garden in the 40s. And so she doesn't describe it as an urban area the way we might today, but she talks about just some of the basic pleasures of life. And so her poems go from one direction to another. Another person that we're going to look at, Maya Angelou. What do you know about her? Who has heard that name? She has read poetry at President Bill Clinton's inauguration in 1993. She was asked to write that poem, very historic moment to have a poet read at the inauguration. She has a long history of her front lines, again, were different. She fought during the civil rights. I almost said Civil War. She is not that old. Um, she, let's see if I can find the dates of when she lived. She was born in 1928 and she passed away. Let's see if I can find when she passed away, only in 2014. So, very, very modern poet. Um, very, very rough childhood. She's a victim of abuse, and she talks about her struggles at the hand of her mother's boyfriend. She experienced racial prejudices growing up, and then she learned to find her strength and find her voice. She wrote a memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. But she also became a national phenomenon with some of her poetry. She writes poetry that touch so many people. She sums up what it's like to be American, what it feels like to be proud of your nation and know the history of where you came from and know the struggle. She's very honest about the things that we struggle with, the things that we don't quite get right, and our growing edge. But she talks about our strengths as Americans as well. So she's moved from very personal poetry to very national poetry. And she even has one poem where she says, I wrote this to every single person. So, that's an entirely different experience uh, than what many of us have had. So when we read her poetry, it's going to speak to each of us different. When I read it, there are times where it makes me reflect upon my own personal struggles. No, I didn't have to fight for civil rights. I was, I wasn't born until the close to the end of the 60s. So I'm not going to give you my exact age. But I mean, I was an infant during the end of the 60s when Martin Luther King Jr. Was shot. And, that was just not part of my struggle. But she writes in such a way that no matter what you've struggled with, you can relate to something that she has written. She has written some powerful poetry about overcoming our challenges. And yes, if you're writing a paper on it, you need to know what struggles she was talking about, what imagery she used because it related to where she was at the time. But then take it further than that and apply it to your own struggles and say, what what have I had to overcome? How can I relate to this national poet, this modern poet? Another poet who's still alive. Let's see if I can find her. One of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. Um, Mary Oliver, again, is just one of those poets who writes on a variety of topics. Uh, a lot of people joke and say she should have a greatest hits book. And some of her books, um, I feel like are like that. She passed away. I was trying to say what year she passed away. Very modern poet. 2019, I believe, is when she passed away. So very, very recent. Uh, and I remember hearing that news and thinking, "Wow, we lost a strong voice." She was 83 at the time. She was at her home in Florida. Um, she spent a lot of her life in Massachusetts. She writes a lot about nature and animals and what she saw on her journey, her perspective. It's very deep and yet very simple at times. It can make us feel something very, very powerful and at the same time um, be simple enough for a diverse group of people to be able to relate to it. I think you're going to like to discover some of her imagery in there. Um, don't shy away from poetry. Read some of Mary Oliver, Maya Angelou, Brian Turner, Nikki Giovanni. These may not be your favorite poets, but experience what they wrote. Get a feel for, put it in their perspective, and then also put it in your own perspective and say, what can I relate to? Can I relate to this imagery at all? Can I feel what they're talking about? Because you have your own struggles. If you're a teen taking this or a preteen taking this, there's things that you struggle with. It may not be on the same level as civil rights or a school shooting or the Iraqi war, but you're facing your own challenges. And that's what these poets are telling us to do. Number one, they're talking about our daily lives. They're saying, look around, appreciate what you have. Mary Oliver, especially, says, find the beauty that's there. Find something that's there, that's simple, that's beautiful, that catches your eye, that helps you remember that you're more than just what you struggle with. Nikki Giovanni does the same thing. Maya Angelou talks about us overcoming and being proud of our heritage, being honest about our heritage. She makes us be very honest about our heritage. We can't just gloss over it and go, oh, I'm a great person. We're a great nation. We all have flaws. And that's what she points out is we have growing areas. So she helps us as individuals and as a nation find our growing areas so we can be even prouder of our heritage as Americans, that we overcame, we grew, we did better the next time we tried a project or um, a form of communication or, to reach out to a particular group of people. She also challenges us to be honest about where we came from, face our hurts, face what we have to overcome. Brian Turner just really makes us take a really good look at the challenges of other people. What have people gone through that you have not gone through? What is it like? When you read somebody like Brian Turner or other poets who have experienced something that you have not, it helps you understand their life perspective. It helps you understand when you read some of his poetry about the Iraqi war. If you have never understood post traumatic stress disorder before, um, it helps you understand the intensity of a battle and what it was like and why a soldier would come home with things that challenge them, with emotions that they have to really work through. And he has worked through that through poetry. And it's just a blessing that he can write it in such a way that we can read it and we can have a glimpse of what it was like to actually be a soldier in the war. And again, that's not all the poetry he writes, but that's one that I'm touching on here in this class. So don't be afraid to just jump in and read some of these. I'm going to break it up in sections, and we're going to look at each poet, just quick glimpses, going to give you some assignments. But I wanted to just give you a little intro here, and I'll give you a little intro on myself. I am a poet. I'm also a novelist, but the very first thing that I ever wrote was poetry. I wrote it in religious situations. I wrote it for church services. I wrote it for friends. I wrote it for me. I wrote it to help me get a life perspective, to understand who I was, and to kind of gain an identity about who I am as a person. That's just one of the ways that I express myself. Not everybody's a poet. No judgment if you hate writing poetry. If I give you a little assignment at the end and it's like horrible for you to get out 4 lines of a poem, that's okay. You have other gifts and strengths. But how I look through the world, I I can process who I am. I can process what I see and what I feel in the world around me through poetry. I have written about the mother of a friend who passed away and what it was like to see my friend's experience of having her mother pass away. I have written about precious gifts that people have given me. I have I have written about my children. I have 2 amazing kids, a son and a daughter, and I have written about what it was like to be their mom. Got my college shirt on today, Bison's mom, um, over here in Arkansas, and Harding University. Way to go. University of Memphis. Way to go. I got a child at each one. I was a graduate of University of Memphis. Go Tigers. I was a Lady Tiger on the track and cross country team. And even during that time, I would write poetry. I write a poem for my coach to process what did my coach mean to me at the time? What was it like to be a young adult trying to figure out who I was without much guidance? I just was kind of just, afloat without much direction. I didn't know what I wanted to do as a career, had no idea which direction to go. And so that's how I make life make sense to me. At the end, I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of my poetry. But until then, um, don't be afraid to get in, conquer these poets, read them. It's not going to be that intense. Remember, it just takes a couple minutes, some even 30 seconds to read a poem. So it's not like I'm asking you to read an 800-page book. But I hope that through this, you really get a sense of the diversity of poetry, how powerful modern poetry can be. And, go back, explore older poets too. There's some great things from the past. But poetry is not something that's just past. Poetry is here. It's now. It's live. So I'm going to do these 4 poets, and then I'm going to introduce you to a lot of other modern poets just through some internet sites that you can go to and see some people reading it and see some of it in print. But just explore. And I hope you like it. Thanks so much for being part of this class. I'm going to get back to work.